I'm going to we are going to record this presentation, and our topic tonight is Duluth's Climate Action Work Plan. And we have the good fortune to have Mindy, Granley, and George. Do you pronounce it Mason, George, or Masson?
George Masson is my name.
George Masson. Okay, great. Thank you. Here to present it. Mindy, I think, Mindy's the sustainability officer for the city of Duluth, and she'll be familiar to many of you from her previous work as the sustainability director at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, where she was for 12 years. Before that, she spent 6 years working on watershed management in the Lake Superior watershed. She's now at the city of Duluth, and working with her is George Masson, who's a sustainability assistant through the Minnesota Green Corps program. George is a conservation biology graduate of the University of Minnesota, and he's working to advance the city's sustainability efforts, particularly with regard to the implementation of stormwater green infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to turn the event over to George and Mindy to share their work.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I remember probably about 8 years ago, bringing a team of students working on solar energy to an Izaak Walton League spring meeting. And the students were so hopeful about what they wanted to accomplish. And just months later, we had doubled solar power on campus. So I think it's the power of the Izaak Walton League meeting that helped us jump that hurdle. So thank you for that. I've been at the city now for 2 years. And I thought tonight I will walk you through the city's first climate action work plan, give you a brief overview of what is in there and how we got this done. And Julie had noted that she wanted some tips about how you can get involved. So I'll try to include some of those facts as we go through it. But just want to set the vision for what we want to accomplish the next 3 to 5 years. Short-term action plan, climate action work plan, we called it, which is a little more eloquent than a strategic to-do list, which is what I originally thought about calling it. But we want to set a foundation that we can accelerate in the future. So go ahead, George. Thank you for steering the slides tonight too. So I have to begin with just acknowledging my amazing team. So I'm the sustainability director, or what's my title? Officer, sorry, sustainability officer for the city of Duluth. And I'm here to make sure that the city is making good choices, that we're measuring our progress, communicating what we're doing, and also inspiring projects and partnerships. But I can't do my work without these amazing young people who I get to work with. So just a shout out to my AmeriCorps Vista member, Julia Forberg, to George Masson, who's here with us tonight, who's working on green infrastructure, and then to my short-term temporary employee, Hannah Zahn-Hess, who's working on a sustainable purchasing scan. Along with my staff who are short-term temporary grant-funded positions, we're also members, the city's a member of the Minnesota Green Step Cities, the ICLEI organization, which is local governments for sustainability, and then the USDN. And those networks and my colleagues within those networks are a super big help in making sure that we get our work done. Next. So the last folks I want to acknowledge is that we do have a citizen volunteer commission called the Energy Plan Commission. And they're a real asset to our work in energy, and they help advise the city on our energy decision-making. And my hope is that this is a future place for more community conversation on energy as well. But just want to give a shout out to all these commissioners who have served and thank them for their service. Next. I think I recognize some names from our Natural Resource Commission on this call too. So thank you for your service, Natural Resource Commission members too. So as a reminder, just in April 2021, the City Council in the city of Duluth declared a climate emergency. And that climate emergency resolution really did a few things. It helped us recognize the urgent need for action. It helped us broaden our goals of 80% carbon reduction by 2050 out to the community. It called for a climate action work plan to be created and delivered to City Council before the end of December 2021. And then it also required annual updates on our progress to City Council. So this built really off of the Climate Mayor's Pledge and America's Still In Pledge, which was basically that the city would stay in the Paris Accord agreement, even if the United States federal level had pulled out. So that was back in circa 2017, I think, 2016. That happened before I got to the city, but our mayor really set the stage for this City Council climate emergency. But one thing it did is really ask us to exceed our goals of 80% by 2050, which is good to have that. And then also broaden our goal from municipal emissions out to community-wide, because the city greenhouse gas emissions are only 5% of our total community emissions. So we have a lot of work to do on our community level. So it was a great tool for us in the energy world. Next, George. So there's really only 4 ways that cities can engage and create change when it comes to energy and sustainability. We can lead by example. We can incentivize climate action through different funding and grants that we give away, or policy funding that we give away. We can regulate and enact new policies or change policies. And we can then also encourage and engage sectors across the community. So we can be a convener as well. Next, George. When we started getting the climate action work plan done, I tried to keep those 4 ways cities can make change in mind. How we got this done: in April, they declared the climate emergency, and this was due in December. Luckily, I had already created a city sustainability advisory team, which I'll talk about in a second. And we were already meeting regularly, talking about how climate change was going to impact all of our work across departments, and then how we should learn from each other and share stories and actions that we were doing, and then work together to create some common goals around sustainability. But we knew we had to get this report finished, and over sort of the course of a couple months, we found funding. Thank you, a shout out to Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program, and also the funding through the NOAA GLISA team, which is Great Lakes Information Sciences and Assessment Program. They actually gave us the funding to do both a Duluth climate action work plan along with a regional climate sustainability forum. And at that forum, we had over 115 people sign up for it and attend it, and really talk about climate resiliency in the northeast of Minnesota versus just the city of Duluth. And just want to give a thank you to Great Plains Institute and Common Spark Consulting, who were the hired consultants to help us form this plan. Next, George. I mentioned the CSAT team. This is just an internal coordination team. One thing that I learned when I worked at the university, and this isn't a criticism, it's just a reflection of the system, is that everyone sort of has their own silo and they do their work and they don't really kind of leave that silo. But in order to be successful for climate action, we really had to get beyond our silos and talk to each other and coordinate our actions. We need some alignment and agreement on our highest priorities around climate. So we formed this team. We started to learn about the expected impacts of climate change. We started to talk about how climate change was already impacting our units and our departments and even our private personal lives. And it was really my job to show that climate action wasn't going to be a whole new workload for everyone, but it was just going to align with the things that we're already doing, the plans that we have, the work that we already have to do, and make sure that we're just doing it in a way that is more climate friendly and considering the climate of our future, which includes things like, you all know, changes in precipitation patterns, changes in temperatures, warming winters, and just weirder weather and more extreme storms. Next. So the plan is a plan for the next 1 to 5 years, and it really reflects not just the mayor's goals, but the council's climate emergency. And we tried to bring in a lot of other local plans. First of all, we have the city's comprehensive plan, Imagine Duluth 2035. There's many tenets in there that we could bring in that relate to climate action, specifically around open space preservation and energy and conservation. We also looked at the St. Louis County Hazard Mitigation Plan to look at what are vulnerable and critical infrastructure needs in the city. We looked at the needs of citizens and the desires of citizens by looking at the Duluth Citizens Climate Action Plan. And since we're here, if you Google the Duluth Citizens Climate Action Plan and you're looking for something to do, there's a whole website with lots of different topics that helps you find, here's ways that you can engage as a citizen of Duluth around issues of climate. So feel free to check that out. It's hosted by Equilibrium 3. And it was one of the many plans that we took into account as we worked on our city climate action plan. We were also informed by like statewide plans about air quality and equity and inclusion as well. Next. So the plan is organized like this. It's pretty short. It's only 14 pages or so. It really has two phases. The first is building a foundation to prepare the city for phase 2, which is accelerating decarbonization of our community. But in order to build a foundation, we need to drive down emissions from our operations in our city. We need to learn the lessons and walk the talk so that we can then expect our community to step up and do the same things that we are doing. Second, we need to strengthen community resiliency. And much of that is related to the services that our ecological assets provide us through stormwater runoff, et cetera. Third, we need to eliminate barriers through policy and making sure that we're able to act on climate. Fourth, we need to find some funding. Fifth, we need to work on some shovel-ready projects to make short-term gains. And then sixth, we need ongoing communication and coordination to make sure we can implement the plan. Phase 2 is really about full decarbonization of our community. And it's an exciting phase, and we don't have to wait till phase 2 to start on that, as you'll see, but it really shows that we have a foundation to set up before we can get there. Next. Throughout the plan, one of the things that we tried to keep in mind, and the CSAT team really centered, was that whatever we do for climate action, we have to be inclusive and ensure that there are equitable benefits, outcomes, and impacts. We don't want certain neighborhoods, certain community members to suffer more than others, and especially those who maybe aren't creating the most amount of pollution, or especially those that have historically been disadvantaged. So we looked to the MPCA's population vulnerability assessment to think about what groups have the highest vulnerability in Duluth. So that identified these 4 groups that we are taking into account throughout the plan. And we really aim to embed equity in both our process, the structure of our plan, and then the distributional work, how we do the work. If we can't afford to do the work across the city, where is the work most needed? And looking at which neighborhoods maybe have the highest energy burden or have the highest amount of asthma rates, air quality issues, etc. So we use this report as a guide. Next. So the climate action work plan has these objectives, which I've mentioned already, but they align with 9 different strategies. And on the column on the right, these are the 9 strategies that City Council members included in the climate emergency resolution. We organized the plan so that the tables sort of refer back to one of these 9 strategies. And these 9 strategies are the things that you think about when someone says, what is climate action? It's reducing energy use, it's increasing efficiency, it's increasing resiliency, it's supporting low carbon transportation options, it's supporting renewable energy, stormwater management, reducing our solid waste, looking at disparities in public health, finding ways that we can grow our economy along with protecting our environment, and then identifying carbon sequestration. So sort of the different categories of action. Next. So you don't need to read this table because you can go to duluthmn.gov/sustain, and maybe George, you can stick it in the chat. On the Duluth Sustainability website, on the right-hand side, there's a column, a bunch of blue bars. Underneath the Imagine Duluth Comp Plan, you'll see the Climate Action Work Plan. And you can click on that on almost any page of the Duluth Sustainability website. You can find our plan. So you can go check out the fine print from your own leisure on your own time. But I just want to give a quick overview of sort of the tables that are in here and how we're going to work on building this foundation for climate action. And of course, the first step is always mitigation, reducing emissions so that we can prevent the worst of climate change. We can do our part to prevent emissions that will cause the worst of climate change. We know we're locked into some change already, but we can't give up on this mitigation sector. So table 1 of phase 1 is all about the ways that we can operationalize things like infrastructure efficiencies and renewing our buildings and making them net zero, addressing emissions in our fleet, our vehicle fleet. Importantly, the table also lists the action leads, who's in charge and who needs to do the work, and then also what resources are needed. So some of the actions, we have resources in-house that we know we can get things done, and others we need to go find resources either internally or externally to accomplish those. Next, George. So the first one we won't spend a ton of time on, but whenever I talk about driving down emissions, folks usually ask about solar. And I will just say that the city has had some success with solar. We know that there's a viable solar resource and solar suitability in Duluth. And we're working to evaluate what are the best sites and options for the city to invest in future and additional solar. So there has been some successful community solar garden subscriptions. We own about a quarter of the array in Renshaw. Actually, a little bit more than that. We know it's performing. We know it's paying back, which is great. We have the Canal Park solar array. We have a small solar array in Leicester Park on the ski trails, and then we have another one on the library. But we have an appetite for a lot more, and we're trying to figure out where are the best places for those, considering land use, stormwater runoff, habitat, all of those things. And George has been a big help in that because of his GIS skill set, really helping us map out where these areas are and what the potential might be. And so we've got a grant in right now with the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships to take the sites that we want to put solar on and then have a community input process where we get some feedback and community buy-in, along with a little bit of technical assistance. We need to know whether the rooftops of these reservoirs can hold solar. We need to know if the roofs are built for the snow loading with the solar. So we need a little bit of that technical analysis, but importantly, we need to have that community conversation and buy-in. Because if we're going to put solar on top of a reservoir that sits in your neighborhood, some folks might really like that, and other folks might be like, hey, that's where I play soccer or walk my dog, etc. So we really want to shop around our ideas and the potential for solar across the city of Duluth. We focus a lot on sites that relate to water pumping, because they're sites where we can't build anything else on top of them, and there's not a ton of ecological value of a big grass sod area, right? But also B, our water treatment and distribution across the city accounts for almost 40% of the city's emissions that we are responsible for. So we know we can't get to our carbon goals without addressing the water utility electrical usage. Next, more to come on that very soon. As part of seeking external funding to get this work done, last May, we had put together a bundle of energy projects. And we had put forth an ask for congressionally directed spending or earmarked spending. And what we found out from that process was that our bundle of projects was really great, but maybe we maybe overshot the ask, and we need to come down on the ask a little bit compared to what other communities had received. So we're looking at revisiting that for this congressional season. But we still want to look at solar and this sort of solar and water pumping kind of nexus of water and energy. I think we have a really great story to tell there, and we might be successful there. We may take out the EV charging portion just because there are so many federal programs coming that will give funding for more access to electric vehicle charging. So we might do that part separately and lower our ask a little bit for the solar and keep in the energy efficiency. So more to come on that. Hopefully you'll hear great news from the city soon on that too. Next. So just want to take a little detour and talk a little bit about solar and how we've invested in solar and what we're thinking for next steps for solar. Back to the plan. The second area of building this foundation for climate action in the future is about community resilience. So many of you are focused on habitat restoration and things like improving stormwater runoff, green infrastructure, etc. So that's where this strengthening community resilience comes in. There's a large focus on stormwater. George will tell you a little bit about what he's working in. When I applied for a Green Corps and green infrastructure, I had really high hopes about what we might get done in a year with a Green Corps member. And And to be honest, they've all been exceeded already. So I'll let George talk about his project, but this area is about reducing flooding potential, restoring habitat, and sequestering carbon in natural systems, and also a little bit about energy conservation and efficiency work in the community. To be more resilient as citizens and residents of the city, we need a more resilient housing stock. How are we going to handle the polar vortexes or the warming summers? So that community kind of resilience lens is what comes in this section. Next. The third section is really addressing sort of the moves that the city can make on policy and planning. And so you can read through this later, but there's some ideas about how we could benchmark buildings to save energy, how we can increase pedestrian and bike access. As a city, we hear from community members all the time about biking and pedestrian barriers in the city and accessibility as well. So those are all things that we included in here. Transportation resiliency, and also a little bit about integrating climate into budgets and decision-making within the city as well. Next. In order to get this work done, we know we'll need funding. So we know in the short term that we can seek external funding and we can try to match internal investments and line up internal investments, capital improvement projects, capital equipment purchases. We can try to line those with climate action, but at some point, we're going to need external inputs to help the city kind of get over this the funding needs in so many of these categories. As you look through the climate plan, you'll see a lot of funding needs. And so we chose to create some of those financial opportunities in a sort of an appendix, which is attached to the climate action plan. And we'll go to the next slide. And part of the financing mechanisms and lining are about, we have some projects that are ready to go. How do we find funding to get those started, or to realign funding to prioritize some of these projects? So we wanted to make sure that when we presented to City Council that they saw sort of the price tag on some of these. You'll notice the energy bundle we already talked about a little bit is in here. But things like a true stormwater resiliency plan, how much that would cost, a true strategic facilities plan about capital improvement investments in our city buildings, what it will cost to eliminate coal as a fuel source. All of those, we just tried to put a few of these shovel-ready projects in front of them so they could start getting their wheels thinking about what the needs are for climate action. Next. And we know there's a lot of federal and state money also available soon through the infrastructure plan. So we've got that on our minds. We were talking about that regularly, and the city has some resources and federal lobbyists that are helping us to make sure we connect with those. So I'll end there for now and let George tell you about his project. He's about 9 months in, and so proud of how far he's gotten. So take it away, George.
Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Julie, for passing on this invitation to present the Izaak Walton League. My name is George Masson, and I'm a Minnesota Green Corps member serving with the city of Duluth and under Mindy Granley's supervision. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, where I studied fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology. And I've just thrown together a few slides from a previous presentation that kind of illustrates some of my work in mapping out where the ideal locations for stormwater green infrastructure could be most effectively implemented across the city. And I just want to say, I've had the pleasure to really get involved in a lot of different sustainability related projects with the city. And really, we could go into detail, and I would love to discuss in detail more of sort of the side efforts regarding solar, or regarding more recently, looking at blight reduction in the city and how those things intersect with sustainability. But without further ado, start talking about my previous position. Prior to working with the city of Duluth, I was a solar mapping research assistant with the University of Minnesota Institute on the Environment, where I helped to create a dual-use solar siting tool, or a strategic solar siting tool, we called it, in Murray County, Minnesota. Now, Murray County is a rural community in the southwest portion of the state. and using community input and feedback regarding their desired location for dual use solar installations, we developed a sort of methodology whereby we took the whole of Murray County and then we began to think, okay, in all of Murray County, where would solar installations most appropriately be sited and where wouldn't they most appropriately be sited? So we started off by taking the entire location and we started subtracting places. So for example, we took all of the standing waters, all of the flowages, so the rivers, the lakes, and the streams, and we sort of removed those from consideration. We then went a step further and we examined, through community engagement, we determined that prime farmland is not an appropriate area for the development of solar. We then went one step further because, as you can see, in Murray County, most of the, this dark green area is considered prime farmland. So that removed a lot of area from consideration. We went one step further and we examined crop productivity index, or CPI, another metric for determining the suitability for growing row crops on a parcel of land. We then removed the roadways and the buffers, and we were left with this sort of a pre-selection scenario whereby we knew that some of these locations would be suitable for solar analysis and that they are solar development, and that they met all of these criteria. They were not in the water, they were not on private farmland, they were not on relatively fertile cropland, they were not in the middle of the road or near the road. But we knew that some of these would be too small. So we started to clean them up. We did what's called a desktop analysis, where we scrolled over the whole of the county and we removed all of the parcels that were perhaps, not ideal, maybe ones that were too small. As you can see, there are a lot of very small dots, areas here that would not make sense for the development of solar. And we are left with this primary siting scenario. So now fast forward, I graduated from the University of Minnesota and I applied to the Minnesota Green Corps program, where when I arrived, I was tasked with determining the ideal locations for stormwater green infrastructure. And so, I'll advance the slide. We took the aforementioned siting set of steps for solar suitability, and we sort of tweaked it. And I know this slide has a lot of words on it, and people always say you shouldn't put a lot of words on your slide, so I apologize. But I left it in because I think it really sort of shows the sort of interdepartmental collaboration that Mindy was discussing earlier, especially with regard to the sort of breaking down of silos. So in discussions with Tom Johnson, senior engineer with the city of Duluth, and Ryan Granley, who is the utility programs coordinator, we developed a set of criteria that we knew would be ideal and not ideal for the development of stormwater green infrastructure. So we decided that we would want all of the areas that are within 75 feet of sort of municipal level stormwater infrastructure, being the collectors, the conveyance systems that run in the utility area underneath roads and sidewalks, within the catch basins and within the manholes. And then we also determined, well, okay, this area of stormwater infrastructure would have to coincide or converge with areas that are either owned by the city of Duluth, is in some form the title holder, or in which these areas of stormwater infrastructure converge with dedicated but inactive road right-of-ways. We then gave a special consideration for those areas within census tracts that would be traditionally underserved and are vulnerable, keeping in mind that green infrastructure, as I'll get to in just a second, has the potential to sort of mitigate the risk of localized flooding. And so as we developed this tool, we figured that examining our underserved or vulnerable communities would be a great place to start in that desktop analysis process. And then we began to really analyze the features. And I'll just move ahead to kind of the more graphic representation of this process. So this is in the west end, this is in the Irving neighborhood of Duluth. This crosshatch yellow area is Irving Park. So in this strategic stormwater green infrastructure siting analysis, we took all of the areas in the city of Duluth that were owned in some form by the city of Duluth, in which the city of Duluth was the title holder. And then we overlaid all of the existing stormwater infrastructure. So these blue lines here are in fact the collectors. These are the conveyance systems that carry water, as I said, underneath the road or the sidewalks. These blue circles that say ST are the stormwater manholes, and these white squares are the catch basins. We then placed what's called a buffer, a 75-foot buffer on all of these features. And now it's not hard to understand or to realize that the city of Duluth has many areas of stormwater infrastructure, a lot of collectors, a lot of stormwater manholes, a lot of catch basins. And so placing a 75-foot buffer on all of these features was computationally intensive. It took 26 hours. But following the conclusion of that analysis, we then decided, okay, give us all the areas where the areas of stormwater infrastructure, this purple area, converge with the yellow crosshatched areas. And again, this is the area of Irving Park. So we were left with a sort of a highlighting where ArcGIS Pro said, okay, here in this solid yellow area is a depiction of areas owned by the city of Duluth converging with areas of stormwater infrastructure. We then removed all of the extra materials to begin sort of removing some of the obviating siting parameters. So the most obvious one were the gas utility lines. So we began by taking all of the service lines and distribution mains known in our ArcGIS Pro database. We placed a 5-foot buffer around these features. Following the buffer of these gas infrastructures, we removed those items. And so you'll see that this area here near this sort of, I don't know, like a park pavilion has been removed. And so following that buffer placement, that is now gone. There was also a sort of relictual stormwater, or not, excuse me, stormwater gas line that ran in this western area of the park. We then placed all of the flowing waters, all of the creeks and streams and rivers in the city of Duluth, flowing through the southern portion of Irving Park is Keene Creek. Realizing that this is a linear layer, we had to place a buffer around this feature, and so we placed a 5-foot buffer just to sort of remove from consideration the areas that are directly on the side of the stream or in the stream bank, an area where we're not going to construct any sort of infrastructure at all, especially not stormwater green infrastructure. From that point, we removed those features. Now, this is just shown for completeness, but this didn't actually alter our siting analysis in the Irving Park area. These solid gray lines are the roads. We realized, if you recall from my previous discussion about Murray County, it's important when you do an analysis like this to remove from consideration the roads, because of course we're not going to place, a rain garden in the center of an intersection or boulevard. We placed a 15-foot radial buffer, meaning a 30-foot total buffer around all the roads to remove from consideration those features. And again, that didn't really change anything. So now, following all of the removal of those obviating siting parameters, we did what's called the desktop analysis process. And in this process, I and Tom Johnson and Ryan Granley, we would sit down and we would examine all of the features that have been sort of highlighted or identified in the siting analysis. And so then we started to actually manually remove what was left over. And so we would look, the GIS mapping tool would provide us a place to look, and we would examine the features to determine whether or not they were feasible for the development of green infrastructure. So these two areas here, examining these topographical contours, this is a very hilly vegetated area right near to a pavilion, so that would be unsuitable. This area here, it's hard to tell because it's solid, but this is actually the parking lot for Irving Park, so this is not suitable. This area, again, looking at these topographical contours, this is a very sloped and vegetated area. Let's see, I believe this is 56 or 55th Avenue West. I'd have to double check on that. But not suitable for the development of green infrastructure. This area here is too small, and also in a vegetated area right near the creek. So that left us with, these areas. And so following this desktop analysis process, we would go and, well, first we would replace some of these features. So we put the stormwater infrastructures back on, put the creek back on, the creek data layer back on, the gas infrastructure layer back on. We would print off a map like this in a sort of a report, and then we would go do a site visit. And so we actually visited this location, this solid yellow location on the western portion of Irving Park. Ryan Granley and I, and also a utility technician, his name is John. We went out to Irving Park and we assessed the area, and we actually found that the GIS mapping tool had actually recommended suitable locations for the development of green infrastructure. This area here was actually the location of an old warming house that has since been demolished, that has since just sort of reverted back to a marshy swampland. This is actually the opposite side, or that would be the west bank of Keene Creek. There's at the terminus of this boulevard is a sort of dilapidated staircase with an outfall that you can't see here. And so, what we would do is we would visit the site and determine whether or not any of these locations would be suitable for green infrastructure. And if they were, we would write up a report. And here's actually a screenshot of the report from the Keene Creek resiliency report that we've come to call it. And then we would take this information, place it into a larger set of reports that could be referenced to either A, pursue federal infrastructure funding, or at least B, make the case to some sort of an appropriator of funds, or to some sort of an organization that we have gone through the process of determining where green infrastructure is best suited, and that we have determined that this is a good location to install green infrastructure. I'm actually skipping over a lot of information. This marshy area here that I was describing at the former location of the warming house is actually identified in a bacterial source assessment from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency as an area that was actually harboring the growth of E. coli and contributing to the impairment of Keene Creek. And so that was sort of another point of justification to go forward in a grant application to say that green infrastructure at this location could A, treat stormwater, B, provide some sort of a flood resiliency to the area of Irving in Duluth, and then also help to mitigate some of those E. coli issues in Keene Creek. So then the last slide that I have just depicts the whole of Duluth and all of the locations that have been identified in that A3 siting scenario. So we've done 7 different iterations of this siting scenario. Map A3 depicts the convergence of areas of stormwater infrastructure and those parcels that are owned by the city of Duluth. But we have, like I said, made other iterations whereby we've looked at parcels owned by the state of Minnesota, as well as local community organizations, to sort of expand our scope and to broaden our angle to see, to really determine where we can install stormwater green infrastructure. The summation now, I'm still working on this project currently, but each of these polygons that have been identified as suitable for the development of green infrastructure have gone into watershed-specific resiliency reports that are meant to provide, sort of move the needle with regard to sustainability, but also do the legwork for utility programs coordinators, namely Ryan Granley, Tom Johnson, and those that are pursuing money to implement green infrastructure. I hope I am being clear. I know sometimes when I'm describing the process of the geospatial approach, sometimes it's clear to me, but I hope I haven't lost anyone. I hope it was interesting. And I think that's all I have. So I believe it goes back to Mindy.
Thanks, George. I think you did a great job. That process is really intricate and data driven. And each one of those yellow dots that George showed has, good and bad to it. It doesn't mean that each one of those yellow dots will be a future project. It means that these are identifying possibilities. So when there is a street project or a park driveway replacement or something floods or gas main leaks or water main leaks or something's being torn up, like we can jump in and say, well, we looked at that area and we thought there might be opportunities to do green infrastructure next time we touch this area. So our hope is that all of the dots on that map will become discussion items and give us a seat at the table for green infrastructure for every decision moving forward.
And
go ahead, George.
I just want to add, I think you bring up a great point, and thank you, Mindy, for making that point. We've talked at length, and you and I, and also Julia and Hannah, the other two members of our sustainability office, our department. It seems that we're always trying to figure out ways to sort of institutionalize thinking about sustainability and working that into the process. I just wanted to get that in there, but I believe that's what you were hinting at.
I'm exactly hinting about that. You're right. And so we're just trying to kind of get ahead of things so we have ideas and implementation ideas ready to go in different areas across the city. So super exciting. Part of my job is to look into how we can fund climate action and implement our full climate action work plan. I mentioned the appendix that was put together of lots of different funding mechanisms that the city could use to move the needle on climate. Some of these have been used and others are brand new ideas that we've never talked about before. But the departmental budgets really don't allow room always for these added costs of green infrastructure or making a vehicle a hybrid instead of a regular or an electric vehicle instead of there's this sort of gap in funding needs. We might have the money to repair a building or a community center, but we might not have the money to repair it to the extent that we want to for energy efficiency, etc. So we know that there will be a gap in this funding, and we're looking really seriously about different ways to fill that. We need to meet first basic capital investment funds before we can move the needle on some of the climate desires as well. So just wanted to point out that we recognize that there's a gap there. Next. I mentioned before that the community emissions were much greater than the municipal emissions, and just wanted to show that in phase 2, we have our work cut out for us. When we go to decarbonize the entire community, if you add up the red and the pink bars, that's all the emissions from commercial buildings. If you add up the light blue and dark blue bars, that's all the emissions from residences. The green is our travel. It's our vehicle miles traveled and our commuting habits. And then on the top of that is our purple, which is waste that goes to a landfill. So to decarbonize all of this, we know it's going to be a heavy lift. But if we can learn the lessons within the city about how to do that, we'll be better set up. Next. And so the hopeful part, even though I've talked a lot about needing funding and gap funding and capital funding, but the good part, the good news is that we do have some internal alignment and agreement on what we should be doing. And the organizational structure won't be a barrier. Our communication and our will isn't a barrier. We have a council that declared a climate emergency. We have a mayor that started, kicked off our climate goals really in 2016 and invested in our energy fund. We have the technologies out there, it's really coming along. I was just mentioning to George that there was a report we looked at from 2011 that the city had prepared, and they had solar in there at $8 a watt. And I was telling George, yeah, it's down to under $3 a watt, really. So these technical challenges are being solved. So the buckets, the barriers that we really need to deal with are ones about resources and capacity, funding and staff time. And then if there's any orange in the policies, we think we can work to address those within our climate action work plan too. So just wanted to point out the good news so we don't end up on we don't have the money to do everything yet. Yeah, but there is some money coming at different levels of government that are recognizing climate now And we want to be ready to be able to apply for it, have shovel-ready ideas and projects. Okay. Lastly, thank you for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. Feel free to check out our website. The website is listed here. And then also, if you're on social media, follow us on Instagram, and you will see sort of the day in, day out stories of what we're working on. So thank you very much. And George and I am happy to answer any questions. And I see a question from Glenn already in the chat. The downward trend in commercial electric emissions, even though it's still dominating the footprint, is likely, yes, a reflection of the changing portfolio of them getting to 50% renewable energy. There's certainly a conservation improvement program work happening within Minnesota Power to address that as well. But actually, I'm applying for a grant with folks from UMD right now to study how we can further reduce commercial electricity use and then also promote commercial solar use. And we're partnered with Minnesota Power, UMD professors, and the city to do a survey and some studies. So.
Hi, Judy. It looks like Julie, it said, can you talk about the types of green infrastructure that are being looked at for these sites? Yes. So the city of Duluth is sort of uniquely positioned on account of being a city. We have the opportunity to access these large conveyance systems that run in the utility that carry tens or hundreds of thousands of gallons of stormwater on an annual basis. And so the siting parameters we identified, that is the areas surrounding the large conveyance systems. We picked that because we realized if we could identify areas owned by the city of Duluth that run adjacent or near to areas with large conveyance structures beneath the surface of the road, perhaps we could offtake some of those flows into a large sort of a biofiltration basin or some sort of a sediment trash diversion structure if those elevations did not allow. So the kinds of green infrastructure that we're looking at are municipal scale, implemented projects that have the capacity to treat tens or hundreds of thousands of gallons of stormwater on an annual basis.
In other words, think filtration and biofiltration. So really slowing down the water and filtering it before it gets into our storm sewer system. We're probably not going to be the community that can plant rain gardens and infiltrate all our water just because of the type of soil we have and the bedrock location in our neighborhoods. But we know we can slow that water and filter it so we don't get that big peak in our streams that can flush out habitat and bring a bunch of nutrients into the system. We need to hold that water back. It's volume and velocity game in Duluth. So.
And you bring up a great point. Duluth does struggle from topographical and geological challenges that make stormwater management difficult. I know that there's actually a regulation that states that stormwater treatment can't be done with a certain level of the water table through the MPCA, which that further complicates things given the fact that we have very poor infiltration rates in the city on account of our type D clay soils. So it's a challenge, but it's kind of like a puzzle to solve that I think is kind of fun.
I see a question from Rich. And about monitoring and measuring our progress. So we use lots of different accounting systems, non-financial accounting mostly. We use the Minnesota Green Step Cities reporting platform that asks questions across tons of different categories, including our emissions and energy use, our stormwater implementation, pedestrian bikeways, access to green space, etc. For our greenhouse gas emissions, when we're measuring those, we use accepted IPCC protocol, which is called ClearPath, offered through the ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability Group. And this is a lot of acronyms, so please stop me if I'm going on too fast. But measuring the greenhouse gas emissions is a big step, but all these other minor measurements that Green Step Cities requires are another way we're doing it. In the future, one of the things that I would like to measure, and I've already been doing this wherever I can get my hands on the data, is how much funding are we putting towards sustainability or climate implementation? Because one lesson I learned at my prior job was really your values are expressed in where you spend your money. So that's another thing I would like to track in the future. So one of the things I did when we were looking at our America Rescue Plan dollars was first to ask for sustainability criteria to be included on the criteria to judge projects that were proposed across departments. So people had to look at, does this reduce long-term energy use? Does it reduce operational costs? Does it help serve underprivileged individuals? Does it help advance equity? So those were some of the criteria we used to pick those projects. And in the end, looking at it, of the 51 million that the city invested, 24 million was really focused on sustainability aspects in our infrastructure and our buildings and energy savings. And then another, I think it was about 19 million had some sustainability benefits to it, although it wasn't sustainability focused. But measures like that, I think on the financial side, Rich, are ones I'd like to get to in the future.
There's a question here. I guess truly, I'm not sure. Is any of the federal infrastructure money available to the city for implementation of the plan? Do you mean stormwater? Are you talking about the stormwater locations, or were you talking about the natural resources management?
No, the climate action plan in general,
Absolutely.
and any of the pieces of it, especially since Mindy, you mentioned resources as one of the barriers.
Well, one of the biggest barriers when you talk about that federal funding is really capacity and staff time to be able to prepare competitive applications, and to make them competitive, get them in, and then manage and implement and administer them all at the same time. So we have to choose carefully. So there's been meetings. It's funny because as soon as I heard the infrastructure money was coming in November, I gathered the directors of planning, property, libraries, our public works, sustainability, and we got together and was like, what is everyone's priorities? We should start talking about it, because we can't apply for 4 or 5 different, grants from the same program. Like we've got to decide on what our priorities are, get behind each other and advance those. And since then, those conversations continue, and the city is lucky to have some federal lobbyists to help guide those conversations and get us to some decisions. But yeah, we can only apply for what we have capacity and people to apply for. So there is a bottleneck, but I think through prioritization, through interdepartmental cooperation, like we can find the gems that we think are really going to be competitive and move the needle. You'll probably see some on energy, you'll probably see some on stormwater, and probably see some on biking and pet access too. Those are sort of the things rising to the top, right? How are we moving people around? How are we powering and heating our buildings? And how are we dealing with all this water? Those are like the 3 main things on everybody's mind.
And Rich, your question, there must be a lot of water running downhill in Duluth during storms. Any potential for hydropower there? I really appreciate this question, and I'm just gonna say probably not. But I think one of the things that I appreciate most about being in this position with the city, being in this field more generally, is that it kind of gives you the position and gives you the power to imagine, literally just imagine, a new world, new solutions to things. And I would be lying if I said I hadn't had that same idea in the past. I think there are some barriers to hydropower and the storm system, but that's certainly a cool idea. I like that.
I think if you saw the amount of debris that gets in those storm sewers, hydro would be the last thing you would be thinking of. The storm pipes have just a lot of junk floating through them, a lot like branches, leaves, sediments, etc. And so, and even litter. So that would be really hard. I know the city of Portland has included some hydro-powered micro turbines in their freshwater infrastructure. And I think it's really cool and innovative. And we do certainly pump a lot of water around the city, and up and down slopes too, right? But when I did the math on the cost of that, for what you could put like a micro turbine in one of our freshwater pipes, you could do solar for cheaper. So And plus you don't have to maintain solar. You just throw it up there and it works for 30 years. When you have micro turbines in your fresh water pipes, I mean, you have to maintain those and you have to make sure they're all working and, you know, all that. There's a lot of moving parts in there. So it's a great idea. And I don't think the DNR would let us dam any streams. So we're not even looking at that.
Water. Yeah.
It brings up a good point too. A lot, you know, over 40 miles of the conveyance systems, stormwater conveyance systems in the city of Duluth are over 100 years old. And they are very, very costly to repair and to replace. It's like the last figure that I had heard from Tom Johnson, senior engineer, is about $950,000 a mile to repair and replace 1 mile of a stormwater pipe. And so, you know, maybe in the future we could look at that, but it would be a while.
I saw a note from Dave Zentner. Dave, back when I was in graduate school, you spoke about our trout streams across the city, and just wanted to give you a shout out because you sort of inspired my path into water resource management way back when I was in grad school. So thanks for that. But then also, are you reading my work notebook? Because yes, your idea about how do we get funding dedicated to climate change gap funding, that's exactly part of what I'm working on. And I feel very optimistic in the future about finding some of that gap funding. I do think climate is a priority of many of our elected officials. And I feel really optimistic about that. So quit reading my work notebook and my strategies because you must be sneaking in there at night. But yep, we're working on that. Anything else that we missed? Oh, Glenn has one. Or go ahead, Julie.
Oh, I was just going to say you had a question from Glenn about which you have seen. So
yeah, we since I started 2 years ago, I have not presented to the Planning Commission. Certainly could be a session, a brown bag session with George and co-presenting. I think that could be a really productive one so that those citizen commissioners could understand what we're working on too. I would say at this point, you know, the city council is probably more informed about our climate plan than many of our boards and commissions, but with time, we will march through and do as many outreach and presentations as we can to solve that.
Mindy, a while back, I heard you mention that when you built your house, you did a number of things, and I've been able to tour Allison Hoxie's house, but I was wondering what kinds of things you did where you put your money where your mouth is.
Sure. Well, in 2009, my spouse and I decided to build a house in the Hawk Ridge Estates neighborhood, which was a neighborhood where they tried to keep the lot sizes small and then keep shared green spaces where we could, you know, protect our wetlands and our forests. And so I chose that neighborhood in Duluth, knowing I wanted to be near where we worked and where our future children would go to school. And so we sited our lot so we could make sure that we orient our house so that we get the sunlight from the south and the east, and that we can block the sunlight from the west and the north. So just how you site a house is really important. If you have a house that's already been sited for you because it's already built, sometimes that takes away some of your opportunities. I would say in my house, the warmest that it gets in my house is on those shoulder seasons when there's just a lot of sun. Like today, if today was sunny, my house would be probably 80 degrees just because it's built to take in all that sunlight and capture it and capture that heat. I put a lot of money into insulation, insulated concrete form basement, an ICF basement, and then just a lot of insulation, doubling the insulation below our slab, increasing. We use the EEE Energy Star program that Minnesota Power had at the time back in 2009. And we exceeded all of those. We did the blower door test, just made sure that first of all, we would use less energy. And the reason we wanted our house to be efficient and use less energy is because I knew I didn't want to burn fossil fuels to heat my home. So if I wasn't going to burn fossil fuels, I was going to buy electricity to heat my home. And that costs more money. So the way to be able to electrify a home is just simply first to use less energy to heat your home. Luckily my spouse is an accountant, so he's got the other type of green on his mind. But when we started talking about alternative heating solutions and what we really want to invest in, we were on the same page about so many items. So we did extra insulation, great windows, great blower door test results, to make sure that when we heated with off-peak electric storage furnace, that it wouldn't cost us too much money. And that's, I think, a privilege not everyone has in Duluth, but when you do have that opportunity and you learn from it, like it's possible here to have an all electric home. And you saw the example at Allison's house, and I'm deeply jealous of her Fujitsu heat pumps, deeply jealous. But it costs money to invest in those things upfront, and then you save long term. And so it's now a game of like, how do we make that possible for more folks, for everyone to be able to access that. But luckily we have these early adopters who test this stuff, and we know it works. So yeah, we had a good time designing our house. And you know, my mom walked through it, and the first time my mom walked through, she said, well, where did you put your money? Because you certainly didn't put it in your cheap countertops, you know. And she was kind of like criticizing about why don't you have granite countertops and, you know, the fanciest new stuff. And everyone was like, why don't you have a gas stove? Everyone has a gas stove. It's the thing. And I was like, I don't want to burn fossil fuels in my house. You know, I don't want the particulates in my air quality. And I just, you know, there's a gas line to my house, but we hardly buy anything. It's there if we have a gas fireplace backup. If electricity is out for more than 24 hours, we can flip on that gas fireplace and generate enough heat so that our house won't freeze in a power outage. And that is because we insulated our house. And we did have a power outage for many days one time, and it was the middle of January. And so I know that backup system works. And when you have a tight building envelope, that gives you that resiliency, so that you can make it through those types of bumps in the road. And that's what many people in Duluth don't have. So when we talk about how our housing stock and aging housing stock, how do we leapfrog and not just, you know, update the facade and the countertops? How do we make our housing stock resilient for future polar vortexes, heat waves in the summer? You know, insulation is key, weatherization is key. I could talk about that all day, sorry.
Are there other questions for Mindy and George? I think we're a small enough group here if people want to come off mute and ask questions. And I guess the question I would ask Mindy is what can the Ikes as a group or we as individuals do to help push for implementation of this plan? Because as we all know, plans can sometimes sit on shelves and not move forward. And I think we know that we all have a role to play.
Absolutely. Well, one thing would be just keep doing what you're doing and learning and being educated and sharing what you learn. I see many names that I recognize here through different ways that you've served in our community. So I thank you for that. But just being that voice of, hey, how does this align with our climate plan? And asking of your elected leaders and the folks that you know, like, how does this work with this? I think a well-placed public comment can, you know, just be the thing that turns people around. So keep up your good work doing that. I also put a link in the chat to the Duluth Climate Plan, the Citizens Climate Action Plan. Lots of ideas for ways that people can get involved in energy issues there. And even some form letters if you feel inspired to write a letter to an elected official, there's some things you can fill out or copy and paste. But just being informed and being a vocal citizen, the things that you're already doing, the things that you're already supporting with habitat and fish habitat. And I hear your name from Diane Desatel, many of you. So it's like, when Kate comes, be her cheerleader, support Kate. Yeah. And I found in my work in the climate and energy realm, you know, there are citizen leaders that I reach out to all the time just to be like, hey, here's what I'm floating. Like, you know, just have that trust to let city staff talk to you about something, talk through something, give feedback on it. Because we're just people, you know, I don't have a mission every day when I get to work. It's like you're trying things, you're testing things. So if any of you are willing to be that person, you know, George and I, like, we could reach out to people, be like, what do you think of this project? I noticed Judy said, interesting that you picked Irving Park. Like, I have 8 questions about that, Judy. Why is that interesting? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Like, you know, what's the history of Irving Park? Because George and I are new, like, we don't know. So if you could be those touch points for even city staff, and I know many of you serve as that already, so thank you for that. But just to continue that work too.
Yeah.
Be my
Julie,
sounding board.
if you, I don't know if you're still, it looks like you're on the call. If you care to comment on Irving Park, and that's all valid information, and you know, we're writing these reports, these resiliency reports, and there are various considerations and angles that we're working into the process. So I would be curious to know too.
As far as Irving goes, you know, I was at the city for the 2012 flood and had to go through learning everything I didn't want to know about FEMA, state and federal. And so it's also in a floodplain. So the only things can go in Irving Park are things like maybe water structures, you know, stormwater structures. And then I got nervous that you were thinking about solar panels, and I'm like, oh my gosh, well, they still play football and soccer and stuff there. So, you know, my brain went all over the place. There's a trail there that got blown out by the flood. There's a WLSSD pipeline that apparently you took into account. And there's the future cross-city trail that's going to go through there. So all of those things in my brain went at once, because that's a park of high importance for recreational and stormwater.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where my brain went. It's like, oh,
Sure.
you're talking about Irving Park of all places.
Yeah, we're talking about some filtration or natural plantings there, not solar panels there.
Right, right.
But when the cross city trail comes through, we can say, hey, if you're going to dig up this land for the cross city trail, this is a great place to add a rain garden or a biofiltration swale or some tree trenches. UMD is starting to use tree trenches around parking lots. When I left, and they look like normal, just trees planted around, but they're engineered to absorb and take that stormwater runoff. So I think there's ways to do it where you still can keep those benefits. But I appreciate you saying that too, because some of the sites that we have our eyes on for solar have become sort of quasi, you know, recreation lands and neighborhoods where our reservoirs are, and they've capped it with a little bit of sod. So that's part of that RSDP grant that we're applying for, is to like say to neighbors, like, okay, so what do we use this for? And how much solar do you think we could fit here where you could still have a place to walk your dog, etc. So I like that you brought that up. And if you have other thoughts on those reservoir sites that you might know of since you were in parks, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, well, we can talk offline. I have a lot of thoughts.
Definitely.
I would love to participate in any of those conversations. You know, you bring up the Cross City Trail. Ryan Granley and I we've spent considerable time discussing the lower Keene Creek corridor, specifically the reaches between South 59th Avenue West and Irving Park for the development of green infrastructure. There are a couple of projects there that have, you know, quite a sizable catchment area. So the opportunity to treat a lot of water is, you know, pretty good in that area. But you know, this kind of hints at the sort of breaking down the barriers, or the silo busting that Mindy, you were talking about earlier. You know, we see you know, a biofiltration basin with some sort of a pollinator plantings, perennial beneficial pollinator grasses, forbs, wildflowers as an educational component. And so, you know, if you can imagine where we can start to collaborate with the Parks Department or with the engineers or with the landscape architects to say, where can sustainability implement, and also stormwater engineers, where can the sustainability department implement green infrastructure, but also increase the our sort of presence across the city through, you know, public educational components placed alongside proposed, you know, city cross city trail corridors. And you bring up the WLSSD line that runs through the corridor there, and I'm going to put a pin in that. But that would be an interesting another quality discussion I think we could talk about.
Judy, if you're willing, maybe could you share your email in the chat, and then George could grab it, and then maybe we could set up a time to sit down offline and walk through some of what your thoughts are. That'd be awesome.
Mhm.
And maybe not in a meeting that's recorded and posted publicly, right? Like, you know, because you might have things you want to
yeah.
say that we want to hear, but you don't want to say in front of everyone. So totally get it.
Interesting.
Also, I'm a sucker for pollinator habitat. I really love those things. So
He really is. Yeah.
Mindy and George, would you share your email in the chat for those who are inclined to take you up on your invitation and follow up?
Yeah, definitely. We just did.
George, I have a question for you about the green infrastructure and stormwater. How do you prioritize site selection between doing it high in the watershed and lower in the watershed? You know, when I think back to Irving after the flood, that was a lake. And some of that was because there was an enormous amount of stormwater coming from high off the hill. So it seems to me that the more that you can do higher in the watershed, the less you have to do down below. But so when you have all of those sites delineated, how do you prioritize them? Or is it pot luck? I mean, Mindy's kind of talking about, well, when we do a project here, then we have this opportunity. But so how do you?
I think it has to be a little bit of both. Like, I
Yeah.
think we have to pick some that are high priority sites that maybe we go for Great Lakes restoration, you know, funding for. And then I think there's going to be some that are like, well, maybe they're not holding back 100,000, you know, gallons of water, but we could do it as part of this other thing that would cost a little bit. And so I think we have to be opportunistic and prioritize some of the larger ones too.
Right. It's, you know, so one specific project I think about is the wetland restoration behind Coles that's apparently going to start producing an enormous amount of wetland water storage that will not only mitigate flooding in the mall area, but also give Miller Creek a more consistent flow throughout the year because of the storage there. So targeting things like that are really important. But when Costco went in, the rules with wetland replacement are so rigid that money couldn't be captured to help fund that project. And instead, wetlands had to be replaced outside of the Miller Creek watershed instead of doing some mitigation inside the watershed where it actually would have been meaningful.
I think you bring up some great points, and there certainly are some hurdles and difficulties that come along the way. And Ryan, Granley, and I have certainly run into just about every one of those hurdles just in the short time that I've been here in the lower Keene Creek watershed. I just want to come back to one question that you brought up specifically about targeting the lower reaches of the watershed for green infrastructure. And so recall, you know, there are various reasons why the city would be interested in implementing stormwater green infrastructure. One of those reasons could be climate change flood mitigation, which is certainly something that us in the sustainability department is something that we're after. But another obligation that we have as a city is to maintain our MS4 permit and to do what we can to delist impaired waterways. Keene Creek is impaired for E. coli. A 2019 study from Burns and McDonald revealed that in the bacterial source assessment that the specific reaches of the Keene Creek watershed that were known to contribute E. coli were from the reaches of 59th Avenue West to Irving Park. That area that I showed in the western portion of Irving Park as a suitable location for green infrastructure was actually highlighted as a sort of a priority area to tackle. And so, yes, while you are right that there are benefits and there are quality reasons to go after wetland restorations higher in the watershed. And those we are looking at those too as they arise in the mapping tool. You know, we are looking at sort of other angles from which we can argue to install stormwater quality green infrastructure like the one in Irving Park.
And the nice thing is, like, this work is happening at the same time that Diane Desautel is launching a natural resources management program plan. So even in the Energy Plan Commission meeting, which we had right before this, one of the commissioners raised their hand and said, well, what are you doing to just kind of like restore the ecology of our area? Because doesn't that provide a bunch of benefits for carbon too? And I was like, well, funny you should ask. There's this strategic lands alignment project, and then there's a natural resources program plan. And so it's so nice to have colleagues like Jim Philby-Williams and Diane Desautel and their teams, and to just have them, you know, running that process parallel to what we're trying to do. Because what George is trying to really do is he's got one foot in sort of the gray infrastructure world, you know, the stormwater pipes and the culverts and things. And then he's got one foot in the green infrastructure world, you know, with the ideas for rain gardens and tree trenches and biofiltration, swales and restoration. And so it's like, well, there's a little bit of both going on and they're happening parallel. So I'm super grateful because we couldn't do all of it ourselves. And Diane and Jim have been working on this for years. But now it's like, okay, so how do we take that work and honor it and then push it forward in the climate plan and go for, you know, federal infrastructure funding from the surface water, you know, fund, and then get some of these ideas implemented. So I think maybe I'll be surprised in a year or two and be really down about it, but I feel really optimistic about our chances to take all these great ideas and thoughts and honor this work and just like implement some of it. Like I feel like we're moving into an implementation era, and I feel really optimistic and positive about it.
We kind of make the joke that our work is like writing a plan to write a plan to plan to get the planners to plan for a plan. But one of these days, and I would agree with you, Mindy, I think we are making substantial progress in implementing something and doing something to really, you know, confer a quality benefit, whether it be to water quality or to our carbon emissions or so on and so forth.
Any other questions for Mindy and George? This has just been really a great conversation here.
Yeah, this is Rich. I did have one thought. You know, we've seen a lot of infrastructure damage. Not that many years have gone by since the 2012 flood and the big storms on Lake Superior and the big windstorm we had in Duluth. It seems like it's one after another. And last summer, I think we maybe came fairly close to possibly having a wildfire problem. And I was wondering if Duluth is thinking at all about that possibility and how to deal with that issue.
Certainly the smoke from wildfires, and certainly with neighborhoods that have high rates of asthma and health disparities and already air quality issues from being located near the interstate. So I think the emergency management really went to like, okay, well, how do we tell people to stay indoors if it's, you know, summer and it's hot and you need to open your windows? So I think it's on people's minds more than ever before. I don't have a specific plan to solve it, but guess what? Weatherizing our homes would make us more resilient to wildfire, smoke, air quality incidents too. If you can shut up your home and you know, keep that air, you know, out, keep the hot air out and keep the cool air in, and keep your windows closed and not have to open them, and not smell that, you know, smoke and those particulates, that weatherization helps that type of resiliency too. At the end of the day, we have to figure out how to move all of these buildings across the city of Duluth, like into electrification ready, which means weatherization, and that will have co-benefits too, like air quality. I don't know if wildfires themselves are listed in the St. Louis County mitigation plan, but I'm going to go check. Yeah, the blowdown and all the available fuel. I don't know if that was in that mitigation plan from 2020, but I'm going to go check. And I know who to call if it's not. So.
Any other questions?
Julie, I had a question, but I'm from Michigan originally, and so we have sandy beaches on Lake Michigan, so this doesn't really translate, but I'm trying to get people to look more at the ecosystem there. And when the water was high, we had beach grass that had roots that were 6 feet down, and people couldn't break it down to even create a beach because the water's so high. Was the ecology here, did you have things like beach grass, or is that because you're more bedrock and rock oriented, so that just doesn't fit at all with your topography?
We do have sandy beaches. There's people on here that can answer that question better than I can. If anybody wants to take a stab at it, please do.
Because in Michigan, they took out the beach grass and put in turf grass, and they wonder why their homes are falling into the lake. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, protection from wave action, totally.
We're doing lots of beach grass restoration on Minnesota and Wisconsin points up here, Jill.
Great.
So, and then also trying to get some established possibly at Interstate Island, a small island between Minnesota and Wisconsin in the Duluth Harbor that has a common tern colony. So yeah, there are lots of efforts to retain and to restore beach grass here.
Good to hear.
Any other questions for Mindy and George?
If not, I am going to get my kids ready for bed.
I am cognizant that you've had a super long day. I really appreciate both of you.
Yes.
Being
Thank
with
you,
us.
George.
So if people want to come off mute and just clap in your reactions, and we have your emails, and I'm hoping that people will follow up with you to provide some continuing conversation, and definitely
Please do. Yeah.
feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
And please do the same. Like, I randomly get emails from people that are like, hey, this electric vehicle's on the market now, like just random stuff. I love it all, and we look at everything. So feel free anytime, reach out, please do.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mindy.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Good night.
Someone needs a kazoo or like a blower thing. That would be awesome. Have a good night.
Thank you too.
You too.